everyone. It's Ulrich Sydney. I'm the president of the Association of Future African Neurosurgeons. And today we have another session of our neurosurgical emergency lectures.
I'm Francine Kankwe. I'm a resident, neurosurgery resident in Morocco. It's with pleasure I would like to present today my topic on cerebral infection processes. When Ulrich gave me this topic, I didn't know what to present because it's a very large. It's it's not simple, but I choose some main thing to share with you on through this presentation. Okay, let's go. I propose this outline after an introduction, gross anatomy, pathophysiology, meningitis. I choose to talk about the meningitis, abscess, and PMR, and the post-surgery CNS infection and conclusion. So, for the introduction, I can say that, infectious disease remain a major cause of death and disability for millions of people around the world. And despite decades of dramatic progress in the treatment and prevention, particularly in low and middle income countries. CNS infection cover the spectrum of clinical acuity from rapidly progressive bacterial infection to slow and even indolent infection by viral and parasites. I would like to introduce here three concepts which are for me very important to take in mind when we talk about CNS infection. The first one is the concept of immune privilege site. So here the scientists consider CNS as a immune privilege site. What's it mean? CNS appear protect from perturbation in the environment by BBA brain-blood barrier that resists the entry of pathogen, inflammatory cells, and macromolecule into the subarachnoid space in the brain. So infection occur when the barrier fails to resist some pathogens. The second concept I would like to introduce here is the way to understand that community acquired CNS infection differ from the healthcare and the device-associated CNS infection or post-trauma infection. They have a distinct epidemiology, pathophysiology, and microbiology. And the third concept I want to introduce here on my introduction is about the strategies to better manage the CNS infection. Remember, I said that CNS appear protect from pathogens, but it also protect from macromolecules like antimicrobial drugs. So we should develop some strategies to lead this drug into the brain, close to the pathogen. Okay. Before going very deeply, let me take 1 minute to show you here the anatomy of structure related to the pathophysiology of CNS infection. On this slide, you can read that there are 5 cavities in the facial and the skull-based bone: frontal, ethmoidal, maxillary, and sphenoidal sinus. Okay. So there are 2 theories about the origin of the paranasal sinus. Paranasal sinus originates from nose and ethmoidal sign versus bone pneumatization. These are the 2 theories. About the embryology, they appear very late, 3 months to postnatal period, and they communicate via channel and ostia. You can see on this picture the 5 paranasal sinuses: the frontal sinus, the maxillary, the ethmoidal sinuses, the maxillary sinus, and the communication, they communicate into the turbinates. Okay. Concerning the embryology of the paranasal sinus, as I told very soon, they appear very late, and the maxillary sinus are the first around 3 months in utero. All of these sinus communicate with each other with via channel and simple ostia. By covering mucosa the cavernous mucosa was in continuity with that of the nasal cavities. Note the close relationship with the teeth, and it's Highmore who first described the precise anatomy of a maxillary sinus with a focus on the relation between them. This is important to understand because the mechanism of propagation of infection from teeth to sinus and then to the brain begin here. What's the root of infection of sinus? You know, the basic principle of infection disease pathogenesis is the root of infection, which is a major determinant in the development of all infection, including those of the CNS. Very simple principle. The host has a finite number of entry points for pathogen, naturally or iatrogenically. The problem about CNS infection is the paradox between the privileged immune system as CNS over tissue on the infection. As comparing to the lung, for example, CNS has a poor classic immune system. There is no IgA, no cilia epithelium, no mucus. There is no filter, and but the CNS is considered invasion as immune privileged tissue. So the main immune tissue of CNS consists only of the BBA, the brain-blood barrier, the microglia, and the additional cellular and humoral defense recruited from outside the CNS as necessary. So the BBB is a neurovascular unit which is composed of astrocytes, end feet, pericytes, and endothelial cells. It isolates the CNS tissue from circulating immune cell and antibodies, and the lack of identifiable lymphatic originally contributed to the design of the CNS as immune privileged site. So pathogens enter the CNS directly through BBA or indirectly by hematogen spread or via contiguous anatomic structures such as cranial nerve, penetrating veins, sinus structure, and so on and so forth. Here, I would like to show you the three ways of invasion of CNS by pathogen. They are transcellular, for example, this is the way of Neisseria meningitis, the Streptococcus pneumoniae. There is also the paracellular, such as the way used by Treponema, and the lytic invasion. You can see it on the picture here. It's a transcellular, C paracellular, and the D and D lytic. The components of pathogens are recognized as by cells which express receptor, and the innate immune response starts. Brain injury and the neuronal death are not mediated simply by the presence of pathogen, but also as a consequence of the host reaction to bacterial components. To be quite complete on this chapter, I would like to introduce here the concept of biofilm and the device related CNS infection. Remember when I was telling you about the root of infection, I said that the principle was based on the entry points for pathogens, and sources are natural and others are iatrogenic. Iatrogenic roots are more relevant to the neurosurgeon and include perioperative breaches in structural barrier, protecting the CNS, for example, the scalp, the cranium, the meninges, and also implantation of foreign body, CSF churns, dural implant, electrodes, spinal hardware. So biofilm concept has been studied to understand the pathogenesis of healthcare and device-associated CNS infection. The first stage is the initial attachment to the biomaterial surface. You can see it on the picture here. The first stage is the initial attachment to the biomaterial surface. This is a passive absorption. Then the cell aggregation and the formation of the accumulation of EPS. And then the detachment of cell and biofilm dispersal, and this maintain the infestation. I refer you to this article to learn more about this concept, the polymicrobial nature of biofilm infection from Walcott and et al. Okay, when you finish about the pathophysiology and the root of infection, I would like to tell you about the meningitis. I choose to tell about the meningitis here. The epidemiology of the meningitis, you know, meningitis can be community acquired and also healthcare related. Most bacterial causing meningitis gain access to the CNS by hematogenous spread from distant sites of infection. Sources include respiratory tract infection, endocarditis, distant abscesses, catheter shunts, and the implantation medical devices. And the direct extension from sinus or ear infection is also possible. Community-acquired meningitis bacterial agents that commonly affect patients are often age-related. So, for example, before 30 days of life, the more common pathogens are the group of B streptococcus, the Escherichia coli, Listeria, and Klebsiella. In children and adults, we have the Neisseria meningitis, Haemophilus influenzae, and Streptococcus pneumoniae. In adults, after more than 50 years, we also have Neisseria meningitis, the S. pneumonia, Listeria, and gram-negative pathogens. But meningitis can occur also from penetrating injuries and post-surgical infection. They have a different profile of infection agents, including Staphylococcus aureus and Staphylococcus epidermidis. What's about the clinical presentation? Concerning the clinical presentation in infants, for example, we can have a poor feeding and irritability, maybe the presenting symptom. History may include elements of confusions, fever, seizure, or headache. Diabetes and alcoholism are often cited as predisposing factors. Cerebral functioning and mental status generally remain intact or only mildly impaired. Fever and presentation is the rule, but occasionally patients may be afebrile. Nuchal rigidity also may be a valuable clue if present, but the absence of neck stiffness does not exclude meningitis. The just accentuation of headache maneuver is more valuable for evaluating meningeal irritation than Kernin or Brzezinski maneuver. A positive test is the patient grimacing or responding that the headache worsens. We can also have the Waterhouse-Friderichsen syndrome. 10 to 20% of children with meningococcal infection produce the large petechial hemorrhage in skin and mucous membranous fever, septic shock, adrenal failure. Focal neurologic signs in meningitis are very, very rare. Okay, when we suspect the meningitis, what laboratory and imaging we can find? So when we suspect meningitis, we should make the lumbar picture after we be sure that there is no mass effect on the head on CT scan, for example. So I share with you that on this table, the different formula of CSF. For example, in the bacterial meningitis, WBC is more than 1,000. Cell type is more than 80% of PMN, and the glucose in the CSF is low, but we have a high protein in the CSF when the patient have a bacterial meningitis. Okay, on this image, I want to show you what's happening on the CT scan when we do the CT scan for patients when we suspect meningitis in patient. Okay. Sorry. What can we see on this CT scan? You can see here the CT scan with contrast which seem to be normal, but it's not normal. If you look at the subarachnoid space, particularly in the sulcus, you will see that there is an enhancing comparing to the usual normal CT scan. So it's a meningeal enhancement. In overhand, CT scan or MRI can show cerebral edema, and if present any parameningeal infection, subdural lymphoma or mastoiditis or sinusitis, revealing the origin of the infection. But the main imaging finding here is the enhancement of the subarachnoid space. Okay, just for memory, I would like to show you here the main useful this table from the paper of Hogg and Spellman in neurointensive care, which summarizes the characteristic of CSF in various types of meningitis and the possible pathogen test to consider. What about the treatment of the meningitis? Treatment with appropriate antibiotic must be urgently initiated in patients with meningitis. For patients in poor condition, they should be admitted in the ICU. The empiric antibiotic choice depends on the host factors such as the age, the immune status, the way the patient acquire the infection, community or healthcare related. For example, in children and adult, third generation of cephalosporin and vancomycin are preferred. The use of steroid is controversial. You know, some authors demonstrate the efficacy of steroid for reducing mortality and morbidity in pneumococcal and meningococcal meningitis. Anyway, steroid, if you decide to use it, should be done a few minutes before a concomitant antibiotic, the first dose, and for only 2 to 4 days. Some health policies suggest the chemotherapy for household contacts and healthcare provider with secretion exposure in cases of Neisseria meningitis. The drug used are the rifampicin, the ciprofloxacin, ceftriaxone, azithromycin, but for instance, it's ciprofloxacin who is more likely to be used nowadays. I want to share with you the usual regimen of antibiotic we use in our center. Is based on cefotaxime, 300 milligram per kilo per days, or ceftriaxone, 75 to 100 milligram per kilo per days, or ceftazidime, 2 grams, quite 8 hours, plus vancomycin, 40 to 60 milligram per kilogram. But there is an information we have to take in our minds. we do not hesitate to ask for the department of infectious disease if there is in your center. Okay, I also choose to talk about the cerebral abscess. The brain infection, the brain infection arises from hematogen spread also, contiguous spread of infected material, especially from the dental, the ontogenic also, and so on and so forth. Patients at risk with cardiac disease, with right to left shunting and chronic lung disease, hereditary hemorrhagic telangiectasia, for example, the Osler-Weber-Rendo syndrome, and the pathogens, the pathogen are the streptococcus in 60 to 70%, the bacteroides in 20 to 30%, the Enterobacter from 25 to 33%. Staphylococcus is found in 10 to 15%, and rarely there is the listeria or nocardia. What are the histologic stages of cerebral abscess? There are 4 stages. The yearly cerebritis in the first 3 days, it's an yearly infection and inflammation poorly demarcated from surrounding brain. And then we have the late cerebritis from maybe 4 to 9 days. It's a reticular matrix composed of the collagen precursor and developing necrotic center. And also the 3rd stage is the yearly cerebritis with the yearly abscess with capsule. It occurs in 10 to 13 days. It's composed with the neurovascularity, the necrotic center also, and we have the late cerebral abscess, which is a complete cerebral abscess with a late capsule. It's appear after 2 weeks. What about the clinical evaluation? Concerning the clinical evaluation, symptoms and signs are not specific for abscess, and most symptoms are related to the increased ICP, for example, headache, nausea, vomiting, lethargy. Fever may be absent, and symptoms are, and the sign may correspond to the area of brain involvement. Hemiparesis and seizure develop in 30 to 50% of cases. A febrile meningitis-like presentation may occur. The lab findings are the increase of ESR, the CRP also, and the leukocytosis. Blood culture can reveal the organism, and the CSF changes are non-specific. And the change in the CSF appear particularly when the abscess rupture in the subarachnoid space on the ventricle. Open biopsy or need aspiration if necessary for culture. Usually, this is negative in 30%, for example. We can do the PCR with DNA sequencing, which may prove useful in establishing the presence of an organism. I want to show you on this CT scan the characteristic, the radiology characteristic of cerebral abscess. You can see here the lesion, the well circumambient lesion, which have a ring enhancement when we did a contrast CT scan. Okay, it's not the same patient, but it's an MRI of cerebral abscess in this MRI. So the MRI is more sensitive than CT scan, and it show hypointense lesion with an enhancing rim, and on diffusion, the access is hyperintense. The treatment of cerebral abscess, there is not one method to treat brain abscess, but the principle is based on the prolonged antimicrobial therapy from around 4 to 8 weeks. Corticoid and antiepileptic drugs are controversial. The patient should be admitted in the intensive care if necessary. Antibiotic alone is possible when the brain abscess, the volume or the diameter of the brain abscess is less than 2.5 centimeter, and when the histological stage of the brain abscess is of cerebritis, and when the patient is in a poor condition to support the surgery. But very often we do the surgery to make the bacterial diagnosis of the pathogens, and also to make the decompression of the cerebral to the brain. And the surgery is very, very useful to when the brain abscess, the diameter of the brain abscess is more than 2.5 centimeter. When the patient is very stable, when he can support the surgery. A lot of methods are described to do the surgery. In our center, we do the aspiration through the bar hole, particularly when the abscess is in very deep location. But sometimes we can do the excision by craniotomy. Here, I show you what we use in our department. When we were suspecting brain abscess by clinical evaluation and the neuroimaging, we first do the aspiration to get material for identification of pathogens, and we start the empiric antibiotic intravenous. Around 1 week, we get the diagnosis and we adapt the therapy. Antibiotic continues for 3 weeks, and then per dose for another 3 or 4 weeks, depending on the follow-up by CT scan and the blood checking. Reaspiration remains possible. It depends on CT scan. So this is very what we do in our department. Just for memory, you can see here on this table which summarize the most pathogen and anti-empiric therapy according to the predisposing condition from Brook in the Journal of Clinical Neuroscience 2017. Okay. The third pathology on which I want to talk is the subdural empyema. The third type of CNS infection. So I think, yes, it's important to discuss this case because it's a suppurative infection that forms in a subdural space which has no anatomic barrier to spread over the convexity and into the interhemispheric fissure. Initial extracranial infection, example, otitis media sinusitis, is followed in day to weeks by increasing localized pain or headache, recurrent fever, and development of cortical scent or focal seizure. Depressed sensorium occur eventually along with hemiparesis and cranial nerve deficit, including papille edema. Lumbar puncture is not recommended, and CSF results are non-specific. Okay. Okay, the most common type of healthcare the The subdural appearance can occur by direct smear or in culture result of tissue obtained surgically may reveal the organism. The CT scan show an enhancement of the margin of a low density collection overlaying and molding the cortex. MRI showed a lesion with hyper T1 and the iso intense to CSF on T2, lying outside the brain. Surgical drainage is always indicated with definition bare hole for liquid poo, and wet craniotomy is usually requirement. Antibiotic is similar to antibiotic therapy is similar to the cerebral abscess. Okay. I think it's important to discuss the iatrogenic or diverse related CNS infection in few slides to be complete on this topic. You know, the most common type of healthcare or diverse related CNS is the meningitis or ventriculitis, followed by subdural empyema and brain abscess. Okay. There are two kinds of risk factor. In the patient, we have the risk factor, the patient risk factor, for example, the age over 65, the patient who have diabetes, the patient who has obesity, tobacco or alcohol have are more likely to have the iatrogenic or diverse related infection. The risk factor about the procedure, the type of location of the procedure, the surgical duration, more than 4 hours, the procedure who make the entry in the sinuses, the volume of blood losing, the CSF leak, the incisional wound infection, and the implanted CLS device. I find this visible in the article from Kubetti et al., who summarized the main surgery which provides the iatrogenic device. I refer you also to this article and this one to I think it's very important to read this article to learn more about the iatrogenic or diverse related infection. Okay, what are the main pathogens we can find in iatrogenic or post-surgery CNS infection? This is the table I found in the paper of Korinek. Yes, I'm coming. Korinek from Paris, who find that S. aureus and CNS number methicillin resistant and also enterobacterias are the pathogen, the most pathogen he finds in his study. Okay. You know, in terms of clinical presentation of iatrogenic CNS infection, let me tell you that the sign of symptom of community acute meningitis are sensitive and reliable in patients with post-surgery CNS infection. It's very, very difficult to analyze the sign because of the possibility of aseptic meningitis. For example, 60 to 75% of post-operative meningitis in neurosurgery patients have aseptic meningitis, and patients are presenting with very vague, non-specific complaints. So it's like a French-speaking who want to learn English. So it's very, very difficult for them. For example, me, for example, to learn. So it's very, very difficult. I mean, it's very difficult to make the real the diagnosis of healthcare CNS infection, particularly in neurosurgery. Routine blood or CSF testing are very, very difficult to interpret also, and imaging studies are also non-specific and challenged to interpret. I would like to show you, for example, to ask you a question, for example, how can we distinguish subdural chronic hematoma from the post-op subdural lymphoma? It's very, very, very difficult. So, you know, it's not specific. We cannot be sure that we can make the distinction between CSF, CSFDH and post-op lymphoma. And some authors propose the use of biomarkers, for example, the CSF lactate and the procalcitonin. The problem is, where do we put the cutoff, for example, for the CSF lactate or procalcitonin? 3, 4, or 5 millimole liter. So I want to share with you on this clinical algorithm. It's Martin and L who put effort to propose this algorithm for the evaluation of patients with clinical suspect healthcare or device associated CNS infection. It's not yet popularized, but I think it could be helpful. I mean, it's not a guideline, you know. However, you can try to use it to have an idea when you are challenging with the diagnosis of post-neurosurgery CNS infection. They also propose a CSF testing algorithm here. You can see on this slide. They distinct the infection confirmed, the possible infection or the infection unlikely. So I will let you the slide and you can see it. Okay, I would like to conclude my presentation here to say that the CNS infection remain a potential life-threatening with a high morbidity and mortality. The etiology are very, the pathogen, the main pathogen is the bacterial, but also we can find the viruses and the fungi. I didn't talk about the virus and fungi. And also, you know, the diagnosis and treatment are challenges. The prompt recognition and treatment of a CNS infection is crucial for patient survival. Identification of pathogens is not easy, and the choice of antimicrobial drugs also not easy. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was a very brilliant and detailed presentation. Like you said, it's not an easy topic to cover. You did a really great job. Starting with key concepts like biofilms and distinguishing the medical device related infections with the non-medical device related infections. I think this was very comprehensive. Thank you so much, really.
Yeah, I'd like to thank him too, Ulrich. You guys have got some solid medical education, judging from the presentations I've seen. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, those that were here have been locked off, probably internet issues. So I think there'll be no one asking any questions. So I'll just enjoy this moment. And so if I may, Dr. Fortuné, what so I guess you're classifying a condition like ventriculitis in the iatrogenic infections, are you?
Sorry, I don't understand. Sorry.
Ventriculitis.
Yes.
Yes. So how would you classify it based on the way you presented?
Okay. Sorry. You know, I don't talk more about the ventriculitis. in our center, for example, it's likely the complication of the EVD, for example, you know,
Yeah.
the extraventricular draining, the drain, and I just see here maybe 3 or 4 cases, you know, but the the problem here about the ventriculitis is the mortality is very, very high, you know, it's very, very increase the mortality. The 3 patients we manage here, all of them are that died. So it's the presence of the poo in the ventricle. So it's it can, yeah, it's uh, and the difficulty here is to lead the antibiotic in the CSF. It's very, very difficult to find the antibiotic who can lead in the into the CSF to manage the cases of ventriculitis. So yeah, I don't have an experience, a good experience about the managing of the management of the ventriculitis.
Okay, thank you. And then the next thing I'll ask is, since we have a lot of medical students that watch this, so what would you say is, in a summary, what medical students should be able to know and recognize about cerebral infectious processes?
The question is what?
For medical students, what would you say they should definitely know about cerebral infectious processes?
Yeah. If I want to summarize, we should suspect the cerebral infection when the patient presents with the infection syndrome, fever, okay?
Yes.
The focal neurologic deficits, okay?
Yes.
And an infection elsewhere who can be the origin of the CNS infection. For example, sinusitis. For example, the what can I say, the mastoiditis, and also, yeah. But I want to add also, there is a lot of cases of post-surgery CNF infection. So when we operate the patient for anything, you know, for any procedure, and the patient have a fever, which which does not respond with the usual
antibiotics.
Yeah. So we should suspect, you know, the CNF infection, do the usual blood testing, the CSF testing, and also the imaging to check for the characteristic of to make the diagnosis of CNS infection. One also thing I want to I can say is the treatment of the CNS infection is based on the prolonged antibiotics. You know, for example, for in the brain abscess in my department, we use the antibiotic for 3 weeks IV, and then we pass per os for 3 or 4 weeks again. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you so much. And you raised some really good and interesting points. I'll add to that if you're a medical student and you're rotating in a department where there's neurosurgery, you should definitely be able to identify cases of post-operative infection early on, because like Dr. Fortuné said, unfortunately, these can be very insidious in their presentations. So you have to be intentionally looking for them. If you're not intentionally looking for them, then you won't find them usually. And if you find them, you find them really late. So you have to be checking up on your patients regularly and documenting every finding you have regularly, because a slight change maybe in the mental status, in the habitus of the patient, or maybe the temperature,
Yeah.
can help the team diagnose and act promptly, because one of the big things is we need to act promptly.
Mm.
Yes, and then the other thing you, Dr. Fortunate, talked about as well is the antibiotics. So we are all struggling and fighting because of antimicrobial resistance, and it's important that medical students as well as physicians understand how to prescribe antimicrobial agents, antibiotics. Is very important. You need to know when to prescribe, how to prescribe, which quantity, how long. Otherwise, we find ourselves with these cases of really life-threatening infections, and the classical antimicrobial agents don't work. You have to look for more complex and more difficult to find antibiotics, especially in a milieu. Things like vancomycin sometimes that are very difficult to find and very expensive as well. So neuropharmacology, you need to have it on lockdown as well. Which agents can cross the blood-brain barrier, which ones cannot, and then which ones are active against gram negatives, which ones are active against gram positives. I think you touched on everything, Dr. Fortunate. Thanks.
I'd like to make if I could, Ulrich.
Yes, please.
And I'm remarking, I'm not a neurosurgeon, I'm a general physician, but I'm remarking as a patient in the hospital with an infection. I had 3 teams of doctors look at me. Not one doctor touched me. Part of diagnosing an infection is a fever, of course. And I think it's important that as a physician, you touch the patient. If you suspect any kind of infection, you feel the area where you think is infected, and you just generally feel the patient. Sometimes that'll give you a clue, as well as establish a little intimacy with the patient, doctor-patient relation. So don't forget to touch the patient.
Yeah. Yes.
You're absolutely right. It's really important to stress this, especially now, for be it medical students, general practitioners, or general practitioners that might be in a department, neurosurgery department. Anything, not just neurosurgery, you have to be very diligent. And being diligent is seeing your patients every day. You need to be aware, and you need to know how your patients are. You shouldn't be relying entirely, on some other person. If you admitted the patient, you have the duty to follow up on that patient. It's not because maybe someone else was given the bed or the word. You don't go, and it doesn't take anything to touch the patient, like you said, John. It doesn't take anything to speak with the family, to speak with the patient for 5 minutes. If you can do that and write notes in your book, then it's easy for you to catch up on these small things. So absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. Unfortunately, Arsene Nyalunja is in the operating room. They received an emergency case, gunshot wound, so they had to go to the OR. So we will have to postpone his presentation. This was already a wonderful one. Unfortunately, we had a few people, but they didn't have good broadband, and then they couldn't follow to the end. But we will have the videos uploaded. I would say John will have the videos uploaded as usual. He's fantastic.
Okay.
Getting us those videos in time and edited, and we'll post on the Facebook page of the Association of Future African Neurosurgeons, and we'll share it out so that those who missed can always catch up on it.
Yeah, Ulrich, I'd like to thank you for being a leader in the African neurosurgical community, and I hope you continue.
Thank you so much. Have a nice day, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.